Welcome to Black History Matters 2022, presented by the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum, also known as NAHOF, located in Peterborough, New York. Black History Matters is an educational series that seeks to highlight historical events in the Black American experience. This series consists of 28 videos that NAHOF will release daily through the month of February 2022. Videos are viewable on NAHOF's website. The mission of the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum is to honor anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery and the legacy of that struggle, and strive to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. This program was funded in part by Humanities New York, with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Today's presenter is Victoria Basulto. Victoria is a Colgate University alumna from the class of 2021, where she received her BA in History and English. She is currently an MPhil in World History student at the University of Cambridge. Her research centers on U.S. and Latin American foreign relations and has worked extensively with the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum to create educational content on U.S. history, particularly regarding abolitionism and the Black American experience. She served as an Upstate Institute Fellow at NAHOF in 2021, where she produced the educational series Black History Matters 2021 and produced Black History in Upstate New York as a Davis Projects for Peace Fellow over the summer. Victoria continues her work with NAHOF as a cabinet member on the Educational Programming Committee. Victoria is also active in international nonprofit work, serving as a grant writer for Partners for Andean Community Health as a 2021 recipient of the Princeton and Latin America Fellowship. She will now begin her presentation. Thank you very much for joining me today. So we are going to be looking at the Supreme Court case decision of Brown versus Board of Education. This presentation is meant to give context regarding two upcoming presentations, which will feature two interviews with individuals whose personal experiences and work highlight the impact of desegregation in our history. One will be an interview with Dr. Betty B. Bibbins, who integrated a school in Virginia in the 1960s, and the other will be with Cameron Patterson, who is the director of the Robert Russa Maughton Museum, which is currently housed in the former Robert Russa Maughton High School, and which we will discuss more about later in the presentation when we talk about the individual court cases that comprised Brown v. Board. But both of these interviews will be published on our YouTube channel in the coming days, so definitely watch out for those. Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka is a landmark Supreme Court case which ruled unanimously on May 1954 that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. This because racial segregation in education, even if, quote, separate but equal, violated the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees equal protection of the laws to all citizens. A bit of context as to where this idea of separate but equal came from would be seen in Plessy v. Ferguson, a Supreme Court case decision of 1896. And this decision recognized that racial segregation of facilities, including public schools, had been deemed legal under the Constitution. How did this case come to court? A man named Homer Plessy, who is of mixed heritage, violated purposely Louisiana's Separate Car Act by boarding an all-white only train car and took his court case to challenge that the law was unconstitutional. Ultimately, the Supreme Court decided that the Separate Car Act was not unconstitutional because although the 14th Amendment established the legal equality of white and Black people, it did not eliminate distinctions based upon color, and therefore, so long as public facilities for both white people and Black people were equal, it did not violate the 14th Amendment for them to have separate facilities. Of course, we know that this did not end up being the case, that facilities were rarely even close to being equal. However, this would set a precedent for a lot of states that would decide to enforce these laws and also for making segregated public schools. Now, Brown versus Board of Education was actually comprised of 5 distinct cases, all which merged and were decided upon the same day. First, I'm going to speak about the one from which the case gets its name. Brown v. Board originated from events that occurred in 1951 when a man named Oliver Brown tried to enroll his daughter in a school in Topeka, Kansas. Both he and his daughter were black. Instead of allowing him to enroll his daughter, the school district told him that he would have to enroll her at a school for black children, which was located much farther away from his home. Together with other black families facing similar discrimination, Oliver Brown filed a class action lawsuit against Topeka Board of Education. He and the others argued that by forcing black students to attend separate schools from white students, they were violating the 14th Amendment. However, by using the precedent established by Plessy v. Ferguson, the district court decided that it was not unconstitutional for the school board to do so long as the public facilities were equal. Thurgood Marshall, who was the chief counsel handling the case with the NAACP, and who would later become the first black justice on the Supreme Court, appealed the case to the Supreme Court, where it would be joined by other cases originating from separate parts across the country, all challenging the same idea of segregation violating the Constitution. The second court case that I will be speaking about is Bowling v. Sharp. Bowling v. Sharp was originally argued separately from Brown v. Board, but was decided on unanimously on the same day as Brown v. Board. The Bowling decision was a bit different in that the court ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional under the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment has to do with criminal procedures, but like the 14th Amendment, contains a due process clause which states that no person should be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This case began when a parent group called Consolidated Parents Group in Washington, D.C. petitioned the Board of Education of the District of Columbia to open the school under construction, John Philip Sousa Junior High, as an integrated school. The school board denied the petition and opened the school as an only white school. So on September 11, 1950, the Consolidated Parents Groups attempted to desegregate the school by enrolling 11 black students, but were refused. In 1951, a professor of law at Howard University filed a lawsuit. The case gets its name from the plaintiff, Spotswood Bowling, who had been one of the black students who had tried to enroll at the school the previous year. The third case is Briggs versus Elliott, where the issue centered around school transportation and its inequality. On October 1st, 1947, Levi Pearson wrote to the Clarendon County School District in South Carolina asking that black students be provided with bus transportation equal to that received by white students. The school district had provided 30 buses to the school district's white children, while Pearson's children, who were black, and other black children in the community, had to undergo a 9-mile journey one way to attend the nearest school for black children. So in total, students were spending 16 miles walking to and from school each day. In addition to the distance, children also had to undergo harsh weather conditions and even at times cross rivers to get to school. Levi Pearson, his brother Hammett, and a neighbor called Joseph Lemon raised $700 to buy a school bus for the children to use, but they were unable to keep funding its maintenance. Levi Pearson's request was refused as the district claimed that the black citizens of the district did not pay enough taxes to warrant buying them a bus, as it was unfair to use white taxpayer money to fund it. The next of the several court cases that combined under Brown v. Board is Gebhardt versus Belton from Delaware. Gebhardt is unique among the 5 Brown cases because the state trial court actually sided with the plaintiffs and ordered that black children be admitted to the state-segregated whites-only schools. While most local, regional, and state courts in the other cases had actually reinforced separate but equal precedent, the Delaware Supreme Court in Gebhardt v. Belton actually ruled that facilities for Black children were unequal and therefore were unconstitutional. However, it still needed the Supreme Court to make the decision to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. Gebhardt itself was actually composed of two separate court cases which combined under one title. The first, Belton v. Gebhardt, was brought by Ito Luis Belton and 6 other parents of 8 Black students from Claymont, Delaware. The parents argued that having to send their children via public bus to attend a high school in downtown Wilmington, the school was called the Howard High School, was violating their children's rights to equal facilities, given that the nearby school, which was actually located inside of Claymont, was not only significantly closer, but also much better provided for than the school their children had to attend. Not only was Howard High School run down and lacking in facilities, but it was also expected to serve the entire state of Delaware. Thus, it struggled with class size and finding teachers with adequate teaching qualifications. The other case, under Gebhardt v. Belton, was Bulua v. Gebhardt, which was brought by Sarah Bulua of Hawkinson, Delaware, whose daughter had not been allowed admission into the whites-only Hawkinson School, number 29, and instead had to attend a one-room school for Black children. Her daughter, Shirley Bulua, also had to walk to school every day, even though a school bus which served the nearby whites-only school passed by her house every single day. The last court case we will talk about is Davis v. County School Board of Prince Edward County, which was filed in Virginia, in which I will talk a bit more extensively about, given that it ties into our interview with the R.R. Motton Museum Director, Cameron Patterson. Virginia public schools were racially segregated since their conception, but segregation in schools was legalized in the Constitution of 1902, the state's first constitution to require segregation. Article 9, Section 140 of the Constitution states, "White and colored children shall not be taught in the same school." Therefore, Black students attended separate schools from their white counterparts, which were much inferior than the facilities that their white students had. On April 23, 1951, the students of Robert Russa Motton High School in Prince Edward County, Virginia, walked out in protest of unequal educational facilities. They had petitioned for a new school for years from the district and had been denied better facilities or a new school. Just consider that their school had been built in 1939 for the Black students of the community. To give a bit of insight into the state of their school, students often had to take classes in run-down tar paper shacks, which had been built to provide more teaching space for the overcrowded high school, which was only meant for 180 students, but which contained 450. Students found it hard to concentrate in these classes as the cold weather made it near impossible to study in the cold shacks, and they lacked basic facilities like cafeteria. Motton's facilities paled especially in comparison to the nearby Farmville High School, which was a whites-only high school, and was located just a few blocks away. Overall, this story is particularly unique, given that the Davis versus Prince Edward County was the only student-initiated case of the 5 that comprised Brown versus Board of Education. The strike was started by Barbara Johns, who at the age of 16 led the student planning committee to engage her fellow classmates to go on strike until their demands for better facilities were met. Eventually, the students, with help from parents and local religious leaders, asked the NAACP to take their case, which they agreed to so long as the students gained their parents' support and were willing to challenge the constitutionality of segregated education, because suing to get a new school was no longer enough. The students agreed, and the case would ultimately make it to the Supreme Court alongside Brown v. Board of Education and end segregation of schools. Therefore, it's interesting to think that this case actually started out as a simple demand for a better school, but would end up forming a part of the move to bring down school segregation. In 1993, the building formerly known as the Maughton High School was closed, and it was declared a National Historic Landmark in 1998. The Maughton School has now been turned into a museum and features a permanent exhibit called The Maughton School Story, Children of Courage. However, the story of desegregation was not over that simply. Several states resisted desegregation and vowed to put as much opposition to integration as possible. The efforts of governors, administrators, and parents became so forceful that the Supreme Court had to address desegregation again in Brown v. Board of Education 2 in 1955, in which it demanded states to desegregate with, quote, all deliberate speed, end quote. Still, though, the court refused to order the schools to integrate right away, as the NAACP had wanted, and it did not set any clear deadline for when schools needed to desegregate. As you can tell, the phrase with all deliberate speed can be left up to interpretation. And so it gave federal district courts the power to look after whether schools were desegregating or not. This obviously opened the door for states to take a very long time to desegregate or to try to find ways around it. For example, a federal district court ruled that Prince Edward County, Virginia, did not have to desegregate its schools right away, and when it was eventually forced to desegregate in 1959, the county responded by refusing to fund the county schools, which meant that the schools had to close, regardless if they were for Black students or white students. They stayed closed for 5 years, from 1959 to 1964. Prince Edward County was the only county in the nation to close its schools for 5 years, rather than desegregate. While Black students' education suffered immensely, unable to go to school unless they moved counties or participated in a community-funded school program, Prince Edward County actually helped white students go to white-only private schools. It wasn't until 1964 in Griffin v. County School Board of Prince Edward County that the Supreme Court intervened again to reopen the schools and force desegregation. This was a similar story in other parts of the country, although not to such extremes as in Virginia. Cooper v. Aaron, for example, in 1958, denied Arkansas School Board the right to delay desegregation for 30 months. The decision reinforced the Supreme Court's power by ruling that states are bound by the court's decisions and must enforce them even if they disagree with them. An example from within Arkansas, Little Rock, Arkansas, of course, had become infamous the year prior in 1957 when images of National Guard escorting Black children into the Little Rock Central High School through screaming mobs of white parents and students were broadcast around the world. This story therefore points to the difficult road to desegregation and how the call for equal educational rights hailed from all over the country to deliver a massive victory to civil rights proponents in the Brown v. Board of Education case. However, as data collected by the Economic Policy Institute suggest, school segregation is still a problem today. Only about 1 in 8 white students attends a school where a majority of students are Black, Hispanic, Asian, or American Indian. In contrast, nearly 7 in 10 Black children attend such schools. Black students are also in economically segregated schools. Less than 1 in 3 white students attend a high-poverty school, compared to more than 7 in 10 Black students who attend a high-poverty school. Therefore, the quest for a fair and equitable system in education is still far from achieved, and we must continuously work and strive to attain that goal. Thank you very much for attending today's presentation. Please help us by completing a brief survey available at the link on your screen and also in the video description box. Your feedback will help NAHOF receive funding and help plan future projects. Additionally, please contact NAHOF with any questions and if you're interested in learning more about the organization and its work. Once again, please keep in mind that in the following few days, we will be uploading interviews with Dr. Betty Bibbins and director Cameron Patterson for you to learn more about these topics. Thank you, and we hope to see you at our next presentations.